Hello there. This is a 12-speed cassette which is going to get installed on the ultimate gravel bike once I recover from the broken chainstay fiasco. This one is 1134. Isn't progress great? It used to be that you would get an extra cog every decade or so. 70s were finished with 6, 80s with 7, 90s with 8, and so on. Give or take a few years, that was the trend. Now, thanks to the unparalleled progress by the most evil company in the world, in a few short years we went from 10 to 12, with 13 being actually a valid option. And yes, I am aware that Campagnolo was the first to 10 speed in 2000, but Campagnolo has been falling into obscurity ever since Shimano went to index shifting, so I don't count them as a valid option. 12 speed was also available earlier. Anyhow, in the world of MTB, 10 to 12 took 4-ish years, mostly due to the 1-by revolution. So I hold this piece of Chinese engineering in my hand. I am ever more reminded that Drivetrain peaked around somewhere around the 2x9 stage, and from there we are just trying a variety of trade-offs while not really getting much in the terms of actual functionality. But before I start to pontificate about this, let's go with a little too long didn't watch. 2x9, when configured well, is a well-balanced trade-off between getting appropriate range and engineering trade-offs such as chain deflection and ergonomy of usage of your drivetrain and aware of the drivetrain. And why is that? Continue listening. So, what I mean that 2x9 is peak is that in the perfect world, on a bike would just pedal whatever cadence you prefer and the machine would just magically adjust to keep the cadence consistent. But we don't live in the perfect world, so we are stuck with these cogs and chains, and those give you just a select few gears to choose from. From then it is even worse, because with an exception of electronic drivetrains, you are the one that is stuck with operating the machinery. Without going into gory details, drivetrain gives you the gearing range, and within that range it gives you a number of samples, a number of gears in that range. For example, this is 12 samples in the 11 to 34. The art of making a good drivetrain, or making yourself a good drivetrain, is to make one that gives you all the range you are sensibly going to use, while also giving you all the gears between top and bottom that you desire. In simplest terms, take any driveline you have. If you find yourself at the edge of the cassette too often and wishing for more, you obviously lack gearing range. The opposite of this also is true. If you never venture to the edges of the cassette, or you are, because for whatever reason, you are carrying useless metal. On the other hand, you lack actual gears if more often than not a single shift gives you the gear that is too far, ratio-wise, from what you wanted. But on the flip side, if you find yourself constantly changing cogs by 2, by 3, by 4 at a time, you most likely have too many gears. Of course, this is not an exact science, and what constitutes good is different for every rider out there. But when choosing components for your drivetrain, you need to balance your needs somewhere between the gearing range you will be needing, the gaps between the cogs you're going to be getting, and of course the operating principles of your machinery, essentially the ergonomy. And of course now you should ask, what's the third thing, because I have already spoken about the range and about the selection of gears. Well, unless you ride an automatic gearbox, getting to that precise gear you want requires some, user input with levers, usually on the handlebars. One lever, that's easy, we all love that. 2 levers, not quite so. 3 levers, well, you most likely need some Mensa lever IQ to operate those. But that's not all. When operating a drivetrain, it makes sense to consider mechanicals of the thing you are operating. A rear derailleur usually just works. Front derailleur requires some forethought when you are going to be using it. Even more so with gearboxes. In essence, if you plan on getting both range and small gearing steps, expect some sort of degradation of user experience. More so if we consider one very important thing. Not all gears on your bike are going to be used equally. In majority of cases, during your riding, you are going to exploit just a few gears out of however many you have. For example, if I mounted this to a road bike, it is more likely than not that I would be somewhere in the range of 13 to maybe 25 most of the time, and I would venture to the edges of the cassette very rarely. Obviously, this would mean that I would wear down these cogs the fastest. So it is obvious that just for now you need to accept that your Eagle blingage golden cassette is going to die out of sudden death of 3 out of its 12 cogs, with some showing very little wear. Deal with it. But speaking of 12 speed, some of you will now point out that aforementioned Eagle is a thing, and so I should just get 1050 and be done with it. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. This is an 1123 10-speed cassette, and I had chosen this one precisely because I want to have tightly packed gears, because when I ride on the big ring, the power fluctuations, the changes in power requirements between different gears at high speed are so pronounced. So if I have very tightly gears to select from, I minimize the changes in power and changes in cadence. Thus, it is simply more efficient. However, in order to get the gearing range I desire, I had to compensate for this 1123 by using a triple. The 1x with 1050 might be fine range-wise, but it only works if you can live with 20% gaps between gears. On the road, you probably can't. At least when actual racing, training, or just plain old gotta be faster ring-ing is concerned. The thing is that the faster you go, the less differences between neighboring gears you want. There's a reason for this. And the reason is that if you want a minor change of speed at 40 km per hour, it means that you need to significantly change the power output to the pedals. Hypothetical jump by 20% from 40 will land you at 50 km per hour. That would require tripling your power output. In the road environment, gear changes of 6-7% are closer to optimal because they imply less change in the power output or less change in cadence. Essentially, such 6-7% jumps in 12 speed would yield 1128 cassette, even something narrower than this one. And that is still a long way from the coveted 500% range which Eagle would give you. But it is true that the more cog a cassette has, the fuzzier the trade-off between range and selection of gears becomes, because you are just brute forcing your way towards the solution. I always held, that's my opinion, that if there were no other considerations, the more gears you get, the more benefits you're going to get. Because either you get more control over your cadence, or you get more range while being able to get away with using less front chain links. Once again, I'm going to use this as an example. This is in 1134 12 speed and has about 300% of range. This is an 1125 10 speed, and essentially it is the same as this one, but without the two biggest cogs. To compensate for the loss of range, you just add another chainring to the implied single from this one. Now you have a 2x10 and you have an equivalent drivetrain. The 12 speed has enough range and gears that with a precise selection of a chainring you can get, well, a functional road drivetrain, and it wouldn't bother most of us because most of us live somewhere fairly flat. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is that extra gears never come with no price tag attached to it. Going from 7 to 8, cassettes became wider. That would cause problems when using the big combination and a touch shorter lifetime of the chain because of the implied usage of cross-chaining. When going from 8 to 9, narrower chain and a touch shorter lifespan still. 9 to 8, the cassette became a touch wider and the chain became a touch thinner. Going from 10 to 11, we have gotten into even wider cassettes by one extra cog, interestingly, and an even narrower chain. Now with 12 speed, the chain got even thinner. During the entire 8 to 12 transition, we lost 25% in chain width, and proportionally we got a shorter lifespan of a chain out of this entire endeavor. This also means shorter lifespan of the other elements of the drivetrain, because length of the chain pretty much determines the lifespan of other drivetrain elements. So if your chain is stretching faster, the rest of your drivetrain is going to follow. And I'm not here to be a doomsayer, because I hammer my 12 speed just as hard as I hammered my 8 speed, and it works. But it remains true that if the engineering skill and effort is kept equal, less material is less life. That is basic intersection of Hooke's law and physics of friction. But let's assume that you can swallow that and, of course, the increased cost of both parts and frequent changes. There are mechanical issues still. The wider the cassette, the more of a problem it becomes to make the chain work correctly on extreme gears, which is something that a single chainring setup requires, or implies, what requires really. The dreaded backpedaling issue of 1x drivetrains is caused by the massive discrepancy between cassette and crankset chain lines. Moreover, this difference, with implied need to ride on extreme chain lines when using 11 or 12 speed drivetrains, makes the chain wear somewhat more important. So, with this long exposition, what about that 2x9? This is an 1150 cassette, 11 speed format. If we take out the 50 and 42, we end up with 9 speed 11 to 36. Now, the family member who is riding this bike is mostly using the 13 to 28, 32 range, essentially the smaller cogs on the cassette. So, if we set up this bike with a double, with the same chainring as this one, the 34 I believe, and 1136, and compensated for the loss of range of these two cogs by adding a granny here, we would be able to drop these two. They are the heaviest part of the cassette, so we would drop something like 300 grams, added in here without much of an issue, and we would get a thicker chain, because that would be 9 speed. In essence, there would be very little loss of functionality, because it would be still the same chainring, and still the usable part of the cassette would be the same, but we would get a lighter rear end, thicker chain, and possibly a shorter derailleur cage. This is another bike of a family member. This one is a much earlier build, but in essence, this is a 9-speed Saint, this is an 11 to 32 cassette, and this is a 35-21 chainring set. In actual usage, the user of this bike is using the same range as the other bike. So he is using the same set of cogs, almost the same sizes. What does it mean? Well, it means that in practicality, both bicycles are operated just with the right lever, and in case of this bicycle, whenever the bigger hill climb is expected out of it, he just drops to the small ring and fires away. Now, you can argue that this is less ergonomical than a single lever, but what he gets instead is much thicker chain. This one was bought, I think, 5 years ago and still works great, but neither of these two bikes are used extensively, or as extensively as I use my bikes. But thicker chain. This cassette is also 4 years old. It always works, because since everything is bigger and thicker, the tolerances are much smaller, so everything is much more reliable. The cassette is wider, but not as wide as 11, so there is no backpedaling problem. Essentially, it is much more reliable. The only cost here is that he added a derailleur. I expect this bike to last, I don't know, 10 more years before something needs to be replaced on it, because it's used so sparingly. The other one, I don't really know. It obviously is a matter of mileage. But as you can see, for all practical purposes, if we are willing to go with the occasional switch to the granny on the front when dealing with climbs, and the front chainring is sized appropriately, the 2x9 is used just like a 1x9, which is then extended to the lower gears with the use of a granny instead of adding 2 extra cogs here. And that avoids all the pitfalls of 11 speed, but gives all the functionality, because in practical riding you are operating both bicycles with just the right lever. In 2x9 you get a thick chain, thick cogs, a good trade-off between chain deflection while giving you all the ergonomy of a single ring, with an extension of a range into low gear category when needed with the use of a granny gear. All that at a much lower price. And thus, without going into other reasons, well, that's the reason why 2x9 was peak drivetrain. And thus, I hope you found this video entertaining. Consider subscribing to the channel, share this video to a bunch of roadies to trigger them, and I hope to see you on the next one. And a little post video. I didn't want this to turn into me bashing on 1x drivetrain, because that's not really a topic. Besides, I am a total slut for multiple cogs, and I have another 12 speed on order. Call me a hypocrite.